Let this story serve as a warning to those who think their lies and betrayals will remain hidden. The truth always comes out, and the price of dishonesty is steep. I married Laura when I was 23, and she was 21. We met in college during my junior year, and it didn't take long for me to decide she was going to be my wife. By the time she graduated, I was already settled on building a future together, and we tied the knot soon after. After the wedding, I found a solid job close to my hometown, where my family ran a large farm. This wasn't just a casual operation. It was a significant enterprise, employing 8 full-time workers and around 45 seasonal laborers. My younger brother, Eric, and I had been part of the farm since childhood, learning every aspect of its operation from the ground up. Eric, 3 years younger than me, never had much interest in higher education. He chose to work as a laborer on the farm, and despite my father's efforts to elevate him to a managerial role, Eric preferred to stick with the day-to-day tasks. He was dependable and hardworking, content with earning his wages and keeping things simple. Unfortunately, earlier this year, Eric lost his battle with cancer, but I'll get to that in a moment. The farm spans about 700 acres, with 3 houses strategically placed on the property. My parents live in the main house, a private residence that doubles as the farm's headquarters. Eric lived in a well-kept carriage house near the main road, while my family and I reside in a farmhouse about 3/4 of a mile from my parents. To secure the future of the farm, my parents purchased an adjacent property under the Family Farm Corporation. This move brought all 3 homes under corporate ownership. Eric and I benefited from this arrangement by living rent-free, which was a significant advantage. While my parents remain at the helm of the corporation, they structured the inheritance so that Eric and I would eventually take over. I was set to inherit 55%, reflecting my active role in managing the farm alongside my regular job, while Eric was entitled to 45%. My controlling interest ensured that I was positioned to take the lead when the time came. This setup created a strong family dynamic, with everyone contributing in their way. As for my household, my oldest daughter is 21, followed by my 20-year-old son, a 17-year-old son, and my youngest, a 15-year-old daughter. Life at the time was exactly as it should be, orderly, productive, and on track. But everything changed about 3 years ago when Eric was diagnosed with cancer. He had a habit of neglecting his health, which allowed the disease to spread before it was caught. Even so, Eric didn't wallow in self-pity. He faced his diagnosis with resolve, continuing to work and refusing to let his illness define him. Eric underwent grueling treatments, including chemotherapy and radiation, but his strength and determination never wavered. Earlier this year, however, his body couldn't keep up, and he passed away. Eric was a good man, but he struggled with certain aspects of life that I had to help him manage. He overcame alcoholism with my guidance, achieving sobriety 4 years before his death. He also faced significant tax problems, which I worked with him to resolve. Eric wasn't the kind of man who could handle administrative matters on his own, so I stepped in to ensure everything was in order. Over the years, we developed a strong bond, and my wife and children were fond of him too, often calling him Crazy Uncle Eric. He was a part of our family in every way, and his absence is felt, not through sorrow, but in the reminder that life moves forward regardless of the obstacles we face. It's important to clarify that Eric wasn't a lazy or unintelligent man. He simply lacked the drive and ambition to improve his circumstances. He was content with his role on the farm and lived his life on his own terms. Over the years, he had relationships with various women, most of whom he met at bars. These flings were often short-lived, and none evolved into anything meaningful. There was one exception, a genuinely kind and grounded woman he dated for a time. For once, I thought he might have found someone who could help him turn his life around, but Eric's drinking habits eventually drove her away. My parents always accepted Eric unconditionally, just as they did me. They loved us both fiercely, even when our choices were far from perfect. Eric's will named me as the executor of his estate, putting me in charge of managing and distributing his belongings. His estate was modest, including a life insurance policy, a checking account, and personal possessions like his motorcycle and truck. A couple of weeks after the funeral, I went to his house to handle his finances and sort through the mountain of paperwork he'd left behind. As I worked my way through the mess on his kitchen table, I stumbled across something unexpected, a bank statement from an account outside of town. The balance was significant, over $70,000. But what truly caught my attention were the names associated with the account. It was in Eric's name, but my youngest son, Joe, was listed as the sole beneficiary under a payable on death pod agreement. I sat there, staring at the statement, trying to process what I was seeing. Eric had never shown any particular preference for Joe. In fact, if anything, he had a closer connection with my older children. Why would he set up an account like this? Why was Joe the beneficiary? I couldn't come up with a rational explanation. For the moment, I chose not to share this discovery with Laura or my parents. I needed more information first. The next day, I went to the bank and, using my authority as the executor of Eric's estate, I inquired about the account. What I learned made the situation even stranger. Eric had opened the money market account shortly after Joe was born and had been making consistent deposits into it every 2 weeks for years. The timing was too specific to ignore, and an unsettling thought began to form in my mind. Could there have been more to Eric's relationship with Laura than I realized? Could Joe be his son? This possibility disturbed me deeply, and I couldn't shake it. That night, unable to sleep, I returned to Eric's house determined to find answers. I searched through every file, every drawer, and every box. Hours later, I found something that left no room for doubt. 2 photographs that would forever alter the way I saw my wife and my late brother. One photo showed Laura topless. The other was even more damning. She was completely naked, holding a beer in her hand, standing in Eric's bedroom. I stood frozen, staring at the images, my thoughts racing. The evidence was undeniable. These weren't just old photos. They were proof of a betrayal that had gone on behind my back. As the night wore on, my emotions ranged from cold fury to calculated resolve. By the time Laura called, asking why I hadn't come home, I had made up my mind. This wasn't something I would let slide. But I needed to think carefully about my next move. I couldn't confront her without a plan. The next day, I took action. I met with my parents at the farm office and laid out the evidence, the bank account, the photos, everything. I wanted them to understand the depth of the situation and to prepare for the storm that was about to hit. My parents stared at the evidence I laid before them, their disbelief written across their faces. My father, usually a composed and practical man, leaned back in his chair with a grim expression, while my mother's silence spoke volumes. Their shock seemed to surpass my own, as if they couldn't reconcile the betrayal with the people involved. "What's your plan?" my father finally asked. I didn't hesitate. "I'm going to confront Laura. If what I suspect is true, I'll start divorce proceedings immediately." My mother, always the voice of caution, suggested otherwise. "Give her a chance to explain herself first. Think this through carefully before making any decisions." I nodded out of respect, but in my mind my course of action was already clear. After dinner, I brought Laura with me to Eric's house under the pretense of needing help cleaning and organizing. Once we were inside, I sat her down, handed her a packet of documents, and told her there was something serious we needed to discuss. I gave her the bank statement first. She glanced at it, her eyes widening slightly at the balance. "Wow, I didn't realize Eric had saved this much," she said, her voice casual. "Read it carefully," I said, keeping my tone even. She read aloud, starting with the bank's name and Eric's details. But when her eyes reached the line that read, "Payable on death to Joe, our last name," her voice faltered. She froze, staring at the page as if she'd been caught red-handed. "Why would Eric do this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "You tell me," I said, my voice hardening. "Is there something you need to confess?" She immediately shook her head. "No, of course not," she said quickly. But her denial didn't sit well with me. I leaned in, repeating the question. "Are you absolutely sure?" Her resistance crumbled under my gaze. "No, there's nothing." She stopped herself, sighing heavily. I pulled the photographs from my pocket and placed them in her trembling hands. The moment she saw them, her body stiffened, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She pleaded for the chance to explain herself, her words incoherent and desperate. Unable to handle the pressure, she bolted to the bathroom, where I heard the sound of retching. After nearly 15 minutes, she returned, looking pale and shaken. Finally, she confessed. She admitted to having an affair with Eric 18 years ago. According to her, it was a foolish and selfish mistake that lasted only a few weeks. She claimed to have realized her error and ended the relationship, insisting that from that point on, she only interacted with Eric in the presence of other family members. Her words meant little to me at that moment. "Is Joe his son?" I asked directly, cutting through her sobbing explanation. "No," she said firmly. "He's your son. Even if he wasn't biologically yours, you're the one who raised him." Her attempt to redirect the conversation only made me angrier. "This isn't about Joe right now," I said sharply. "This is about you betraying me with my own brother." Despite her tearful pleas for forgiveness, I remained unmoved. I stood up, my resolve unwavering. "Don't come home until you've composed yourself," I told her coldly. "I don't want the kids seeing you like this." When she finally came home an hour later, she tried to initiate another conversation. I stopped her in her tracks. "We'll talk when I decide the time is right," I said firmly. That night, we shared the same bed, but when she tried to cuddle, I turned away, making it clear that she wasn't welcome in my space. She cried quietly, but I didn't flinch. My boundaries were set. The next morning, I went to the main house and met with my parents again. I shared Laura's confession and confirmed my decision to pursue a divorce. My mother, still in disbelief, asked if I was sure this was what I wanted. "It's not what I wanted," I told her plainly. "But I can't trust her. There's no coming back from this." Returning home, I confronted Laura one final time. "We're done," I told her, my voice devoid of emotion. She broke down completely, begging me to reconsider, insisting the affair had been brief and meaningless. She swore that Joe was my son, but her words carried no weight anymore. Her betrayal had already sealed her fate. I reiterated firmly to Laura that Joe was not the issue here. My love for him remained unwavering, regardless of his biological father. I made it crystal clear that this was about her betrayal, her actions with Eric, and nothing else. Whether it happened 18 years ago or a lifetime ago, the gravity of her betrayal hadn't diminished. That same day, I contacted our farm's attorney to discuss the matter. Understanding the gravity of the situation, he referred me to a divorce attorney he trusted, a seasoned professional who handled such cases efficiently. Wasting no time, I scheduled a meeting for that afternoon and began initiating the divorce process. The attorney provided some reassurance, explaining that the farm and the 3 houses, all owned by the Family Farm Corporation, would remain protected during the settlement. Thanks to my parents' foresight, the corporation was structured so that any personal issues, including divorce, wouldn't jeopardize the farm. The assets were untouchable because my parents were the sole officers of the corporation. This safeguard had been designed precisely to prevent an ex-spouse from claiming a share of the farm if one of us faced a divorce. However, not all the news was good. Because Laura had not worked outside the home during our marriage, I was likely required to provide spousal support for at least 5 years, possibly longer. Even her infidelity wouldn't negate that obligation. The laws, as the attorney pointed out, seemed heavily skewed in her favor. He advised we could challenge this in court, but the odds weren't promising. I had expected this, though. Money wasn't my priority. I simply wanted to end this marriage and move forward. That evening, I broke the news to Laura. Her reaction was immediate and predictable. She fell apart, crying uncontrollably and begging for another chance. I didn't budge. "No," I said firmly. "This is done. You made your choice years ago, and now I'm making mine." I informed her that I would be speaking to the children over the weekend. I planned to talk to Joe first, one-on-one, and then gather all the kids together to explain the situation. Laura asked if she could be present during these conversations. "Absolutely not," I said bluntly. "You'll have your chance to speak with them afterward if you want, but not while I'm explaining things." On Saturday morning, I approached Joe and told him we needed to talk. We walked to the creek on the farm, where a small pavilion with picnic benches offered privacy. It was there, in that quiet setting, that I told him the truth. Unsurprisingly, he was devastated. His first reaction was to ask, through tears, Will you still love me if I'm not your biological son? I didn't hesitate. Joe, you're my son, no matter what, I said firmly. I raised you. You're part of this family, and nothing can change that. I told him not to dwell on the possibility and emphasized that this situation had nothing to do with him or his siblings. This is about your mother and me, I said. It's not your fault. It's not anyone's fault but hers. Joe was quiet for a while, processing everything. I gave him the time and space he needed, and after some more discussion, I let him know that I planned to speak with his siblings next. He asked for a bit of time to prepare himself for the conversation, and I agreed without hesitation. I assured him that I would always be there for him, and that nothing about our bond would change. Back at the house, I kept up appearances. Laura's behavior had noticeably shifted. She was quieter, more subdued, but the children didn't seem to pick up on the tension. We spent the afternoon by the pool, playing cornhole and tossing a frisbee, creating the illusion of a typical summer weekend. But beneath the surface, the reality was far from normal. The shadow of Laura's betrayal loomed over everything, and I was determined to address it directly with the rest of the family. After dinner that evening, Joe approached me, letting me know he was ready to talk to his siblings. Unfortunately, they all had plans with friends that night, so I suggested we postpone the discussion until the next morning. The following day, we followed our usual Sunday routine. We had breakfast as a family, attended church together, and returned home by mid-morning. Once home, I gathered the kids on the back patio and told them we needed to have a private discussion. One of my daughters immediately asked if their mother would be present. No, I said firmly. This is a conversation I need to have with you all first. She'll speak with you later if she chooses. The tension in the air was palpable as I began explaining the situation. I didn't sugarcoat it, and I didn't shy away from the truth. I told them about their mother's past affair with Eric, the betrayal it represented, and my decision to divorce her. Their reactions were heartbreaking but expected. Disbelief gave way to anger, which eventually settled into quiet sadness. One of my daughters, unable to contain her emotions, declared that she wanted nothing more to do with her mother. She was furious and felt utterly betrayed. I stayed calm, reminding her and the others that they were adults now, capable of making their own choices about how to handle the situation. However, I encouraged them to take their time before making any hasty decisions. Your mother made a terrible mistake, and that's on her, I said. But she's still your mother. Think about the good moments you've shared, and don't let this overshadow everything. Despite my advice, the children were understandably upset and hesitant about speaking to their mother. I then brought up the possibility of conducting DNA tests for each of them. I want clarity for myself and for all of you, I explained. It doesn't matter what the results show, my love for you doesn't change. You're my children, legally and in every way that matters. They nodded in agreement, though the room remained heavy with emotion. That evening, Laura joined them in the dining room for what I knew would be a deeply emotional conversation. I didn't involve myself, but I overheard fragments of their discussion. The children expressed their anger and disappointment while also reaffirming their love for her. Still, it was clear that their perception of her had been permanently altered. Forgiveness, if it came, would take a long time, and it was unlikely their relationship would ever be the same. For Laura, the weight of their judgment was devastating, though it was no less than the consequence of her actions. From that night on, she moved into the guest room, where she stayed until the divorce was finalized, a grueling process that stretched on for nearly 8 months. Throughout that time, Laura begged me to reconsider. She proposed marriage counseling and pleaded for forgiveness almost daily, but I stood firm. I had no interest in repairing something so thoroughly broken. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, an unexpected opportunity arose. A developer approached my parents and me with a substantial offer to purchase the house my family and I lived in, along with 80 adjacent acres of farmland. After careful consideration, we agreed to sell. It was a practical decision, and the proceeds allowed me to focus on building the future I wanted. Laura found a modest 3-bedroom apartment in town, where she moved with our 2 youngest children. The transition was hard on her, and the reality of her choices hit her harder than she'd anticipated. She fell into a deep depression, requiring multiple medications and treatment to cope. Meanwhile, I temporarily moved back into my parents' home while pursuing a long-held dream, building my own house on the farm. I worked with an architect to design a beautiful, mid-sized log cabin with 3 bedrooms. It was everything I'd envisioned, a space that reflected my values, solid, enduring, and entirely my own. Once it was completed, I moved in with my 2 youngest children, who split their time between my home and their mother's apartment. Though Laura continues to struggle with her depression, I've made peace with the choices I've had to make. Life on the farm moves forward, and with every passing day, I rebuild a life free from her betrayal. Laura has shown signs of improvement in recent months, and she occasionally expresses a desire to reconcile. However, my stance remains unchanged. I have no interest in reviving what we once had. While I treat her with the respect and empathy she deserves as the mother of my children, my feelings for her are long gone. The moment I discovered the affair, any affection I had for her was extinguished, leaving behind only a sense of duty. Our conversations now revolve solely around the children. While I've maintained boundaries, I can't completely sever ties, as she has no one else nearby. Cutting her off entirely would only hurt our kids. Despite everything, I feel some level of responsibility for her well-being, even if it's not tied to any lingering affection. One source of relief came from the DNA tests, which confirmed that all of my children are biologically mine. Knowing this has lifted a heavy burden, but it hasn't changed how I feel about Laura or her betrayal. The wounds from what she did run too deep to ever fully forgive. As for why Eric set up the account for Joe, the question lingers unanswered. Laura insists they never discuss paternity, and I believe her on that point. Still, it's strange that Eric made such a decision without explanation. Perhaps he assumed something or wanted Joe to be his in some way. Whatever his reasons, they died with him. Despite the unanswered questions, I'm content with where I am now. My relationship with my children is strong, and I've made peace with the past. Restoring trust with Laura is neither possible nor a priority, but I still hope she finds her way to some form of happiness. I suppose that speaks more to my character than anything else, caring about someone who caused such damage. Reflecting on everything, writing this has helped me appreciate how things have unfolded. At 51, I've rebuilt my life and created a foundation I can be proud of. My focus remains on my children, my work, and the life I've built on the farm. It's not the life I originally imagined, but it's one I've come to value deeply. Laura's work as a real estate agent kept her busy, requiring frequent interactions with various people, exploring neighborhoods, and engaging in community activities. While her job provided a good income, over $120,000 annually compared to my $40,000, it also revealed her penchant for attention, particularly from men. She had a habit of flirting, which she often dismissed as work-related charm. I had voiced my concerns in the past, but her apologies always felt more like deflections than genuine remorse. Her upcoming trip to Miami was no exception to this pattern. She invested a surprising amount of money in new clothing, despite already owning a closet full of expensive outfits. When she left, I thought little of it. The trip was only meant to last 4 days, and I planned to focus on my own work during her absence. However, on the second evening, my plans were interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. A man in a formal suit stood on the porch, holding a large manila envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing it over before quickly leaving. Opening the envelope, I found a note that read, "Contact me if you want to discuss the photos," along with a phone number. My heart sank as I pulled out the first image. It was Laura, seated on another man's lap, locked in a passionate kiss. His hands were on her back, and they appeared to be in a nightclub. The second photo was just as damning, a poolside scene where she and the same man were embracing and kissing. Without hesitation, I dialed the number. The man on the other end introduced himself as a private investigator. He explained that he had been hired by another husband suspicious of his own wife's infidelity. While tracking her social circle, he had uncovered Laura's behavior as well. He had included 3 more photos in the envelope, photos of Laura in a bed with the same man, leaving no doubt about what had occurred. My immediate reaction was a surge of anger, followed by cold determination. There was no room for excuses or explanations. I called my father to tell him what had happened. He urged me to stay calm and to hold off on confronting Laura until I had everything in order. "Don't tip your hand yet," he advised. I assured him I would proceed carefully. The next day, I consulted with an attorney online, explaining the situation and the evidence I had. The attorney informed me that Florida's no-fault divorce laws made infidelity irrelevant in court. While disappointing, this didn't change my decision. I told him I wanted to move forward, citing irreconcilable differences, and began making arrangements to file. When Laura returned from her trip, my plan hit a minor delay. She had 2 days off from work, so I couldn't act immediately without raising suspicion. On the third day, after she left for the office, I took action. I contacted my father and a close friend, Kenny, for financial help with attorney fees. They agreed without hesitation. That same day, I hired a lawyer and instructed them to proceed with the divorce filing. I began packing my belongings and moved most of them to my father's apartment using his truck. I didn't plan to stay there just yet. I wanted Laura served with the papers first. 2 weeks later, while she was at work, she was finally served. Almost immediately, my phone lit up with messages from her, full of confusion and questions. That evening, she showed up at the house unannounced. Before she arrived, I called my father and asked him to be present. I didn't trust Laura to handle the situation calmly. He arrived 5 minutes before she did, standing by as a quiet witness. When Laura walked in, she went straight to the point. "Why did you file for divorce? What's going on?" she demanded. I reached for the envelope I had prepared, pulled out the photos, and handed them to her. "This," I said bluntly, "is why." She froze as she looked through the images, covering her mouth in shock. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to form words, but I didn't let her speak. "Don't insult me with excuses," I said firmly. "You made your choices, and now I'm making mine. This marriage is over." Laura attempted to stammer out an apology, but I had no interest in hearing it. "Save it," I said coldly. "We'll settle this in court." With that, I walked away, leaving her to process the gravity of the situation on her own. As expected, she flooded my phone with calls and messages in the following days, suggesting everything from marriage counseling to open discussions. I ignored them all. When her attorney got involved, they fought hard to contest the divorce, but my legal team held firm. In the end, the outcome was favorable for me. I received $60,000 in equity from the sale of the house, along with $1,900 per month in spousal support for 3 years. The division of furniture was insignificant to me, and I let her take most of it. It wasn't worth the trouble. About a month later, I learned something that added salt to the wound. One of Laura's close friends confessed that she had known about a prior affair Laura had during our marriage. This friend admitted that she had considered telling me, but ultimately decided it wasn't her place. Now, she apologized for her silence, saying she regretted not informing me sooner. I responded calmly, telling her that if I had known back then, I wouldn't have wasted another decade in that marriage. It's been 8 months since the divorce was finalized. During this time, Laura has continued to send me text messages nearly every week. They range from casual inquiries about my well-being to mentions of how the children are curious about me. I haven't responded to any of them. Changing my phone number feels unnecessary. It's my choice to keep it, not hers. Besides, I refuse to let her dictate any part of my life anymore. While the pain from this experience lingers, I've found support in friends who understand the importance of moving forward. They respect my boundaries and avoid bringing up that tumultuous chapter of my life. I've also started therapy, which has been a valuable step in my healing process. Despite everything, I know I'll be fine. For now, I focus on myself and the future. What's behind me no longer defines who I am or what I'll become. The betrayal may have shaken my trust in others, but it has also reinforced my belief in my own strength. With time, I'll rebuild, not just a life, but a better one,